I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Bruce Fein, an American lawyer and former Reagan administration official. He's an expert in constitutional and international law, and we're going to be talking about Trump's war with Iran and how it flouts the Constitution. More broadly, we'll also discuss the follies of empire. But before we get to that, I need to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener-funded, so if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, if you can, support my sponsor, Mike Swanson's Wall Street Window. It's a great financial and trading newsletter. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, sign up for the Wall Street Window newsletter. You won't regret it. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Bruce Fein. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest I'm very happy to have on. Bruce Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan and is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy. His website is lawofficesofbrucefein.com. You can find him on X at Bruce Fein ESQ. And I've been reading his work on and off for some time now through the fine folks at antiwar.com. They often link his work. And we're going to be talking here about an article he wrote about the Constitution and the Iran war. Bruce, could you maybe tell us what led you to write this article for the Baltimore Sun? Trump's unilateral war flouts the Constitution.
Well, I was around when the War Powers Resolution in 1973 was enacted. It was in response, in part, to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that really forfeited the congressional war power over Vietnam. It endowed the president with infinite discretion to decide to fight wars not. We know it got extended under Johnson and then Nixon into Cambodia and Laos. Congress ultimately repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in late 1970. But the War Powers Resolution was an attempt by Congress to reassert its declare war authority. All the viewers or listeners on this program should understand that 100% of the Constitution's authors, including James Madison, George Washington, James Wilson, those who were at the Constitutional Convention, they understood the declare war clause in the Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, endows Congress alone with the authority to take the nation from a state of peace to war. And the reason for that decision was that the executive branch, all history shows, including British kings, had an inclination to concoct excuses to war, because during wartime, president or the executive powers becomes infinite. Everything is crucified on a national security cross. The framers did not want to repeat that, even as confident as they were that George Washington would be the first president and most disinclined to abuse the power. In fact, George Washington, as president, made it explicit that only Congress can take us from a state of peace to war. And until Congress has deliberated on a matter, the president could not use the military in any offensive way. So I want to underscore, there is no ambiguity in the language and purpose and coverage of the declare war clause. No more ambiguity than there is in the Constitution statement, you've got to be 25 years old to become a member of the House of Representatives. It is that clear. But as the United States began to evolve, I say, from a republic whose glory is liberty into an empire whose glory is domination and control, to be a successor, if you will, to the British Empire, the law began to change in fact, even though nothing in the Constitution was amended. And so the war power began to gravitate towards the president. And it's not a Republican or Democrat issue on both sides of the aisle. Okay. And the reason is that if you're running an empire, you need a Caesar. You can't have deliberation. You have to have things that are secret. You have to have energy. It made, like Napoleon said, the only thing worse than one good general is two good ones. Because you have to have unity of command. And so the war power began to migrate to the executive branch. I think it hit sort of its high water mark in the 1900s with Harry Truman's war in Korea, where he didn't get any congressional authority whatsoever to fight the war in Korea. And it's hard to say that wasn't a war. Tens of thousands of Americans died, millions of Koreans died. We even had a risk of a nuclear attack across the Yalu River against China. 3 million Chinese came in. Anyway, the idea that this wasn't a war would be absurd to make that claim. And yet it was fought, and Congress did not push back. But the War Powers Resolution of 1973 was enacted, at least to try to devise mechanisms short of impeachment to regain the war power. And so in Section 5C, the War Powers Resolution says, among other things, that anytime that the Congress passes what's known as a concurrent resolution directing the president to cease hostilities, he must do so. The difference between a concurrent resolution and a joint resolution is a concurrent resolution is not presented to the president for veto, so there's no ability to require a 2/3 override vote. Ordinary legislation or joint resolutions, the president can veto, and very, very difficult, not impossible, to get an override. So the War Powers Resolution has been there since 1973. This is the first time that Congress has employed its concurrent resolution authority, passed by the House and the Senate, which meant that Republicans in both chambers were voting for it because it couldn't have passed only with Democrats, which don't control either house. And President Trump has simply ignored the concurrent resolution. He's ignored the act. Now, so you get to the situation is, okay, well, how do you enforce it? Well, one way, and there's an effort underway, is for Congress to bring a lawsuit. Gregory Meeks and Tom Massey have sponsored legislation directing the House Speaker to file a lawsuit, seeking an injunction at least, or declaration that the president is in violation of the War Powers Resolution. And that has not passed yet. In May, after the recess, I think that all indications is the Iran war becomes more and more unpopular and more a quagmire every day. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, there's different strategies every 10 seconds. I mean, that's not an earmark that the United States or Mr. Trump knows what he's doing. So that's why I wrote the article. And he said, in Congress itself is as much guilty as abdication as presidents are guilty of usurpation. And the article really was, hey, how come you're not trying to enforce the resolution? I say there's an alternate way to enforce the resolution. It's simply to state it's an impeachable offense. They can simply pass a resolution to the president and say, if you don't comply with a concurrent resolution under the War Powers Resolution within X days, 30 days, 60 days, and end the hostilities, we will impeach you for a high crime and misdemeanor, because presidents are obliged to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and force the war to a conclusion in that way.
I wanted to ask, how would you compare this war that President Trump has started with the sort of foreign interventions and imperial activities of the U.S. under recent presidents, George W. Bush, Obama, Biden, etc. How would you compare and contrast it? Because this seems like we're in an even more dangerous moment, even though previous presidents weren't so great on foreign policy either.
No, I think that we have to accept that prior presidents have been flagrantly in violation of the Constitution, the Korean War being one. That's Harry Truman. And if we go then beyond that, I think Lyndon Johnson did not have a declaration of war when he was fighting in Vietnam. In fact, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 was based upon a falsehood that there was a second torpedo attack on an American vessel, which wasn't true. It was based upon at least the implied falsehood that we were not, we're spying, we're conducting covert operations against North Vietnam. We're de facto engaged in warfare against North Vietnam. And it made it seem like North Vietnam was the aggressor. No, we were. Remember, North Vietnam has never attacked the United States, ever, and never will. We are over there. But that's just one example. You remember under Lyndon Johnson, we sent in troops, Marines into the Dominican Republic without any declaration of war because we thought it could go communist. You remember also, we intervened in Chile in the 1970 elections. We helped to overthrow and have the assassination of Salvador Allende in 1973 because we didn't like him. And we ended up with a General Agustino Pinochet, a murder and torture. And we've continued on that same path without congressional declarations. George H.W. Bush in Panama, and he went into Kuwait. There was no declaration of war. And Bill Clinton did the same. In fact, Bill Clinton asked for a congressional declaration of war against Serbia. He lost it. So he just attacked anyway, So they've all done it. And then we have H.W. Bush. He didn't get a declaration of war in Afghanistan. He didn't get one in Iraq. And Obama tried to get a declaration of war against Syria. He couldn't get it, but he went after ISIS anyway. He never even tried to get a declaration when he bombed and turned Libya into a wilderness, overthrew the Gaddafi regime. And now, as we're here today, which is like 15 years later, it's simply a failed state. We just washed our hands like Pontius Pilate and say, you know what, that's your problem. ISIS and terrorists are back into Libya, but it's all run by militias now. So it's unfortunate that this is a very, very long-term trend. And it's not limited to Republicans or Democrats. Both sides do it. I mean, with regard to Biden, yeah, he basically made us a co-belligerent in Gaza because we are funneling all these weapons that we knew would be used by Israel to attack Palestinians in Gaza. He used them to attack not Palestinians, but Arabs in Lebanon. And he's done the same with regard to Ukraine, funneled weapons and intelligence and whatever. We don't have any declaration of war against Russia. And think of this too, if the president really had a case to be made for war, he's got all the secrecy, he's got the bully pulpit. Just go to Congress, go to the public and tell Congress, I want the vote. Vote for me. And if the intelligence is convincing, he's got a sympathetic Congress that's controlled by Republicans. He should be able to get a declaration. If he can't get a declaration, the reason probably is the war isn't worth fighting. It's as simple as that. Unfortunately, say that's where we are with regard to Trump. Iran is just the latest. He also invaded Venezuela with the military to kidnap Maduro. I don't want to defend Maduro and his other things. He is a dictator. But, there are a lot of other dictators. We're not invading North Korea, and that's a dictator. We're not invading Saudi Arabia. MBS is a dictator. All these Persian Gulf states are dictators. We don't invade them. It's not that we praise dictatorships, but we understand the limits on our power. We're not going to turn them into Canadians. Not going to happen. The cultures are too distinct. And so our goal is just to rise them to minimize, if we can, the injustice. And by example, we can encourage their indigenous people to have something more resembling self-government and a Bill of Rights. But, we can't force it. If their cultures don't accept it, that's not going to change, at the end of a bayonet. And we should learn that. 20 years in Afghanistan, 20 years, more than $2 trillion. We didn't change anything there. Taliban 2.0 is even more misogynistic than they were before. So what did we succeed? And it's not a matter. I don't think that we intended for greater misogyny, but you got to be smart enough to know when the cure is worse than the disease. Why you do it? The best medicine we have abroad is example. I remember early on, 1979, this was after Mao had died in China after the Cultural Revolution. They had democracy wall in Beijing. They're posting and we weren't using any military force. They're posting copies of the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States. They called democracy wall. Well, that's the best that we can do, And then they ended up with Tiananmen Square. So, I mean, and even if we're just thinking about it in a very crass way for our own security, if China is involved with internal upheavals, they're not going to be involved in adventurism abroad, right? They don't have the luxury. It's like, Iran wasn't involved in adventurism abroad when we attacked because they had their own indigenous convulsions, right? So I think that's all that history teaches. Even if we think at the outset of our birth as a country, under the George Washington, when in our Declaration, the greatest fear that we generated in Europe was not by a single tugboat. We had nothing. They were terrified of the Constitution and the Declaration because it threatened their power base. It made people think, why do we have kings and queens, right? All it was the example. Right? And that was not an accident that, within a couple of years of our drafting the Constitution, the French Revolution unfolded. It wasn't a carbon copy, unfortunately, of the U.S. Revolution. But certainly, if you look at their initial constitutions, it largely was adopted in response and as modeled after our own Constitution. So those are kind of other additional observations to make. But this is sheer lunacy what we're doing. All empires do it. And the only reason why we're different is that we're the only empire that at least has an architecture called the Constitution that entrusts the war power to the Congress. And if it would be exercised, we wouldn't be in all these places. I say Obama couldn't get Congress, even the likes of Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz, to vote a declaration of war against Syria. They're not going to do it because there's nothing in it for them. War reduces Congress to an ink blot. Why they reduce themselves to nothing? They gain nothing from it, whereas war aggrandizes the presidency. So we don't have to focus on personalities, and that's why the framers of the Constitution wanted to entrust the war power to Congress. Now, if we look historically we're now looking at something like 236 years. The only time Congress has ever declared war, 5 conflicts, 5 is all. The last one after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And in every case, Congress had concluded that we were already at war. We had been subject to attack already, whether it was by submarines in World War I, the blowing up of the USS Maine and Havana Harbor in Cuba, Mexican-American War. The Mexicans allegedly, had shot American soldier on American soil. I think that was a lie of President Polk. And then the War of 1812, the British were basically kidnapping our seamen, invading our sovereignty on our ships, our maritime commerce. 5 times in 236 years, and never a war not in seeming self-defense. And that's just the nature of the beast. And that's why the framers wanted to entrust the war power exclusively to the Congress.
What do you think? I've spoken with other guests about this fiasco with Iran. I think it's been just a travesty. But what do you think the sort of second order and third order consequences will be of this foreign policy disaster going forward? Because one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is I thought the constitutional angle to this story that we've seen unfolding is important, because a lot of us are focusing on just the immediate way in which this is an embarrassment and a strategic folly to go to war with Iran. What do you see as the longer term consequences of what has happened, though?
Well, we're projecting. Anytime you project politically, you're in dangerous territory, because politicians have 87 ulterior motives. What they profess they're interested in isn't really what it is. They're all scheming for power. But if we take a snapshot now, and maybe we're in the prediction market territory, I do think that it's all going to be between now is August 5th and November polling day. It's all going to be negative for Trump and Republicans. They got no positive game plan. I don't think the Strait of Hormuz will be open. We're certainly not going to shut down their nuclear program. And we're not going to, and Iran right now, they understand that they have the upper hand. And one of the reasons why they have the upper hand, we're stupid. We don't understand that no matter what we do to Iran, China and Russia will give them limitless assistance because they're bleeding the United States dry. We're spending billions of dollars a day. So when we talk about, well, we destroyed these weapons and that weapons, they're getting a resupply. And China and Russia are doing it for their own reasons. They're trying to weaken the United States. It's the same way when we were in Vietnam. Of course, we had all the weapons superiority over North in the world, by far. But the Chinese and Soviets, yeah, they're helping the North Vietnamese. Why? Because it would bleed the United States. And we did the same thing in Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded in 1979. Said, fine, you go in there. So this is Charlie Wilson's war. If you ever watched that movie, the Stinger missiles or whatever that we're giving to the Mujahideen. And so we aided them. It wasn't because the Mujahideen had huge revenue sources. Maybe they had some from opium, but we gave them all the weapons they needed and more. And that's just because, okay, we'll bleed our adversary. We're so dumb. We really think Iran was going to be isolated, and North Korea and Russia and China would sit by and do nothing. No, they say, hey, this is a cheap way, to pummel the United States. And the other thing that I think is I do believe that as a consequence of our invasion, an attack on Iran, it's going to cause nuclear proliferation. It's more solidifies the idea that the only way a country can be secure from an attack by the United States is to have nuclear weapons. They saw in 2011 what happened to Libya when Gaddafi abandoned WMD, 2011. We went in and destroyed them, right? They see perhaps the country with the worst human rights record ever, North Korea. No one's laying a glove on them, right? Nothing. Why? Because they got nukes. This is a signal to every country in the world, including the Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar. We need to have nukes because that's the only way that we can prevent what happened to Iran from happening to us. So this is going to be a huge contributor to nuclear proliferation, which is going to be bad for the species.
Well, in terms of, I guess, what it means for the U.S. and the rule of law in the U.S., do you think there's any longer term consequences to what is essentially a lawless war? I mean,
yeah. No, I mean, there are two responses. One, I mean, really, there may be, if Congress gets a backbone, they could impeach and remove the president, And I mean, it's even conceivable that you could have something like Nixon's resignation, that if the war becomes, you already have substantially more than 2-to-1 Americans opposing the war. And if you ended up in November with a crushing defeat of the Republicans, Congress taking control, the Congress might be emboldened to impeach and remove the president. Now, at that point, they may even try to strike a deal, that they have some doctor will examine Trump and say he's really ill, so he has to resign. And he can say he's 80 years old, so he's not so embarrassed. And he could leave, and J.D. Vance comes in, shuts down the war, something like that. With regard to lawlessness, I think we've already passed the Rubicon on that score, unless Congress stands up to the plate. We have a president who's openly boasted to the New York Times the only restraint on his power is his own mind and moral conscience, which is, and before that he said, then I have Article 2 where I have the right to do anything I want as president. That's July 23rd, 2019. So he's already said, I can do anything I want. And Congress sits there and where's the pushback? I mean, this guy's proclaimed that he's king. It's unimaginable that if George Washington made those words, say in his inaugural address, that he wouldn't been impeached and removed in 5 seconds. You do not, for impeachment, you don't have to wait till you've fallen off of a cliff. If you become concerned that the incumbent is no longer a trustworthy custodian of the rule of law, and our liberties, you get rid of them. It's like on The Apprentice, you're fired, right? And one of the American people often don't understand is if you're impeached and removed from office, you don't go to jail, you don't pay a fine, you just lose office. You can go back and he can have his billions of dollars and Mar-a-Lago and do whatever else he wants, but he doesn't have the power to get us into these crazy wars. But that means that, and I think that's a possibility depending upon the outcome of the November elections. But I say because politics, you're dealing with what I call sociopaths with 87 ulterior motives. It's hard to have a high confidence level of any particular outcome. Now, I do have a high confidence level in this, but it doesn't relate to the immediate future.
Why is that? Why do you have a high confidence level
in this one
case? Yeah.
That with regard to what I'm going to say right now, because all of history for tens of thousands of years have vindicated it. We start out with the understanding, time is infinite, and every single empire the sun is set on. No empire has ever endured because they all overreach and try to run the world. So there is going to be a time when the sun sets on the American empire. What we are doing today is setting a standard, setting precedents that will entitle and will encourage and embolden every country that we're destroying now. As soon as our empire dissolves, they're going to attack our posterity. Our kids and grandchildren are going to be slaughtered, and they'll have no defense. The others will just say, this is what you did. This is payback time. That is going to happen for sure. It's just a matter of how long we wait for that. Right now, you and I don't feel that fear because, hey, we're number one. Iran's not going to invade us, Venezuela. They don't have the ability to. It's going to take time, for our fortress, to deteriorate. When our vulnerability then will be exposed. But it will come. The British thought their empire was going to live forever, including Winston Churchill. You got to come up and very quickly, right after World War II. It started even before then. All these other empires crumbled too, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, French Empire. They all do. It's inevitable because it's the nature of empires to overreach, and they can't sustain themselves anymore because they're fighting 87 front wars, and they've diverted all of their resources to proficiency in killing rather than in making life more pleasant for their populations. And I believe that really is a huge sin, if you will, cardinal sin on our generation. That is, we are acquiescing and setting precedents that will come back to destroy not us, not you and me, but our children. And we don't feel that we should feel guilty about that.
I was going to say it's the embodiment of a sort of imperial hubris is what we're seeing today.
Yeah, well, it is, but I want to underscore this is not unique to the United States. That's what you have. All these other countries, they did exactly the same thing. So if we go back, just as one example for your audience here, Thucydides is writing in his history of the Peloponnesian War. There's battles between Sparta and Athens. Who's going to be at least the dominant empire in the Aegean Sea. And the Athenians, they approach the island of Melos, and they tell the Melians, listen, you got to pay us tribute. You got to be an ally for us against Sparta. Melians say, no, hey, listen, we don't want to do that. We want neutrality. Right? We just want neutrality. You don't want to do an injustice to us. Listen, that's unfair. And they say that there'll become time.
Is not to interrupt you. Is this the famous time where they respond with the strong do what they can, the weak do
it. Weak suffer what they must. Yeah, it is. It is that dialogue called the Melian dialogue. But you get an A+ on your report card. Anyway, so but the Athenians think now their empire is never going to end. And they say, you know what, to the Melians, listen, don't give us that kind of saccharine belief that you would act in a different way. If you had our power, you would do exactly what we're doing to you. So you have no moral high ground to stand on. So they slaughtered the Melians. And of course, the Athenians they lost their own empire as well, with Alcibiades and going to Syracuse and all these other dumb things that empires always do. But that shows you that it's the empire mentality that disbelieves that it will ever end. Rudyard Kipling, everybody in Britain thought the the empire would survive forever. So I'm not trying to, and the reason why I make these observations is I'm not trying to pick out the United States as being worse than any other empire. It's not. All the other empires are the same. I suppose it's only worse in the sense that we live in a more technologically advanced age, so the amount of havoc we can wreak on other people is far greater. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You couldn't, even though the Greek Trojan War was bad, if Hector is fighting Achilles, it's not industrial scale murder. It's one against one. But we do it at a much more proficient rate. So I think that makes our moral culpability greater.
Closing out, what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation? And I mean, there's a lot of doom and gloom right now, and I can understand why amongst many of us, but what is your hope going forward? Do you see any glimmers of I don't know, possible change in a sort of reversing of course, at least on the part of the American public, and hopefully with Congress? I'm just trying to find that silver lining. It's hard to, though.
Well, I don't know why they call it silver lining. I do think that what I hope that anyone who's watching the show would do is that every day you should be calling your member of Congress, say, what are you doing? You have this war power. You passed the concurrent resolution. You enforce the law. You're abdicating your responsibilities. You take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Now, one voice, you can say that just seems kind of soft and doesn't accomplish anything. Well, but you can say that about voting too. You pass one vote out of tens of thousands or millions of others. It's just the obligation we have as citizens of the United States. It may succeed, it may not. But whether it succeeds or not, whether it's likely to succeed, it's the right thing to do. It's not costly. You don't have to make a PAC contribution. You don't need to be Elon Musk. And that's what self-government is. I mean, I do it every day. My offices are right near Congress. I write letters. I write op-eds. I'm up there advocating all the time, saying, well, how come you're not doing XYZ? Meeting up there. I'm not asking everybody to be in Congress like I am. But in the internet age, it's not a burden to send an email, to send a text message. I don't know whether they do fax machines anymore. And that's what being a citizen means. So I also think that everyone on this program should be inspired by this knowledge. The 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, they're not anonymous, who signed 250 years ago. They signed their death warrants. They knew they didn't win that war. They're being killed, right? And they signed their death warrants for what? These unalienable rights that you and I are enjoying right now. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, government by the consent of the government, right? There was not a foreordained result that the war would end as it did. At that time, we're a little tiny eastern seaboard collection of colonies, and the British Empire spanned the entire globe. We were a little kind of speck in their empire. But anyway, they took the risk, right? They succeeded. With bravery, courage. Some of them lost their lives, not all, but they all made sacrifices. They all signed their death warrants, and they didn't try to conceal them. That wasn't in secret language or whatever. The British knew who all the signatories were. So it seems to me that we all have an obligation, at least in partial gratitude for that sacrifice and risk, to do what we can to try to bring this empire to a close. Collectively, we can do it. I can guarantee you, the members of Congress, like the president, they're sociopaths. They want to stay in power. You make it clear to them, I'm not voting for you unless you discharge your obligations under the Constitution. Then it may have an impact. But I'm not going to guarantee it. Politics can work in very flukish ways. Sometimes takes slow, sometimes goes very fast for a lot of reasons we have no control over. But there's one thing that's unforgivable, and that is not to try.
Well, I want to thank you again, Bruce Fein, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work?
Well, I would go on. What I write is all on my website. Is probably the best way to keep account. I also have a 100-book reading list that everyone should. It'll keep you occupied for a while. But there's plenty to read on my website, www.libertyonline.org. law offices of brucefein.com. If you just put in my name, you'll get probably more than you want to see of myself. And I also want to, the listeners here should understand, in my belief anyway, there's this quest for justice, liberty, freedom. It's collective, we all have the same dignity as human beings, all the same DNA. So I don't like this idea of hierarchy. Some have more talents, more aptitudes than others, but it's got to be a team effort. I call it a team effort from the citizens. It goes back to Ben Franklin during the Revolutionary War. We all hang together, or we all hang separately. It's up to us.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.